Students, today I will discuss very important questions in our series expected questions from GS Economy in Civil Service Means 2025. These questions may be asked in two ways. First, is our GDP growth rate is sustainable? First expected question is our GDP growth rate sustainable or second maybe same question is our GDP growth rate steady. There are the two expected questions, very important because of nature of the UPSC exams, previous year questions. This questions is very important. For the better understanding, better writing, first of all you have to develop the structure of your answer. And as I discussed, structure of answer carry 3 points. Number first is introduction. Number second one is expansion. And number third one is conclusion. If you create first introduction, expansion, conclusion, then you have to introduce yourself with the key point of this question. In case of first question, sustainability of GDP growth rate is the key point. In case of second question, steady GDP growth rate is the key point. Now you are clear. Now differentiate between sustainability and steady growth rate. Sustainability growth rate is that which sustain if in 2024-25 GDP growth rate is being 6.5%, it means its stability is that if it will grow consistent growth rate as it is in 2024-25, 25-26, 26-27 and so on. That is the stability, sustainability or stability in our GDP growth rate. The steady growth rate is the dynamic, some broad concept, you can say. What is the meaning of steady growth rate? If our GDP growth rate is fully providing employment, full employment, without any inflation, without any recession, if our economy growing with full employment, that is known as steady growth rate. Now you are clear about the difference between sustainability of growth rate and steady growth rate. Now you can introduce within 10% of the word limit or 15 words. Similarly, conclusion 15 words and 120 words in your extension because you have to write down this question in 6 minutes, not more than this. Now you are clear about the introduction. Introduction, you will create on the basis of key point, and I have discussed the complete concept of key point in this and that questions. What is the expansion? You can expand your answer by fragmenting it in two parts. This expansion you can divide. Which factor determine the growth rate? Means factors determine, upper side you will consider factors determine GDP growth. It may be steady or sustainable. First factor, internal factor, and second one is external factor. External factor. Third point you can analyze macroeconomic variables. What they are in nature. After that you will conclude these questions very easy. For the explanation, this internal, external and macroeconomic variable, you have to memorize certain data from economic survey, budget, current economic survey and budget. If you can get a textbook on Indian economy, latest Then you can take the data from that book also. What kinds of data? As you know, factors determining growth rate classified by you simple aggregate demand, and second one is aggregate supply. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The aggregate demand is constituted by the consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and export and import. There are the four major determinants of aggregate demand in our economy, that is consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, export and import. In short duration, aggregate supply, the remaining constant, it means aggregate demand is determining our growth rate. For the better explanation, what kinds of data you have to be memorized, that is first consumption. If we consider consumption, as you can take this data from the consumption data from the economic survey, private final consumption expenditure during 2024-25 increased by 7.3%. In terms of GDP, it increased from 2024 from 60.3% of GDP to 2025 61.8% of GDP. It is the highest growth rate in consumption since 2003. Highest growth rate. Why it is increasing? Because of government policy. It may be fiscal policy or it may be monetary policy, or you can say macroeconomic policy of the government. Now you are clear, some data is there. Similarly, for external factor explanation, you also keep mind certain data given by International Monetary Fund. What the IMF says, during 2023, World Economic Outlook data given by IMF for this year, world GDP growth rate. World GDP growth rate, this GDP growth rate was 3.3%. In 2024, it was 3.2%. 2025, it was 3.3%. Expected during 2025 to 30, 3.3% per year. This is the data given by World Economic Outlook published by International Monetary Fund. These certain data you can keep in mind. Similarly, macroeconomic data like consumer price index, that is inflation rate, fiscal deficit, current account deficit, foreign exchange reserve. These data you can say foreign exchange reserve sufficient to import 22-month, current account deficit is 1.2% of GDP, fiscal deficit is 5.4% of GDP under controllable limit, consumer price inflation index being 4.6%. These certain data you can keep in mind for the directing your answer. Now, how you can utilize these kinds of knowledge for better explanation of your answer? Now you have to think on that point. When you analyze this point, you should divide this to 120 words in three parts. 1, 2nd, and 3rd. Means divide this three. You have to write down 40 words on each factor. 40 words. 40 years. You can change, there is no, you can write down 50 year, 30 year, 20 year, no problem. According to your priority, but you have to cover at least 120 words according to your knowledge and information which you have collected from different sources, economic survey, budget, or textbook of an economy. Now write down internal factor. What you will say? Our GDP growth rate is internally determined. Rural consumption expenditure, private final consumption expenditure is increasing very sharply, and it is highest since 2023, 7.3%, which is responsible for high GDP growth rate as it was predicted by our Central Statistical Organization for the year 2024-25 in economic survey 6.4%. Actually, it was 6.5% as the data given by the Hindu newspaper. In terms of GDP, our consumption expenditure increased from 60.3% of GDP 2024 to 61.8% of GDP 2025. And in future, now you will say, in future it is expected to be increased because of government policy. Government, as I priorly explained, this aggregate demand depends on consumption investment. Government capital expenditure increasing consistently, which you can use these words in your explanation, internal factor, crowding effect. Due to this crowding effect, our private sector investment also increasing and government expenditure, if you include this, export also increasing. From India, despite there is a trade war due to uncertainty in international trade policy, but our export is increasing, import is not increasing accordingly at higher. That is why current account deficit is also controllable. All these internal factors are responsible for steady growth rate, which is expected to be in future. In the same way, without any disturbances because of political stability in our economy, external factor, they are disturbing supply chain disruption, cause problems are there. As you know, Hamas and Israel war, they are creating the hurdle in the international trade. 10% of the global trade of India go through this Suez Canal, which is disturbed by these kinds of wars, similar Ukraine, Russia war also disrupting the international supply chain. These and third point which you have to keep in mind, geopolitics, and third point which you have to keep in mind, international trade policy uncertainty also responsible. But despite of all these uncertainties, our International Monetary Fund World Economic Outlook giving the statistics that the growth rate 24 was 3.2% of world GDP, 23 it was 3.3, again 2025 was 3.3, and expected to be 3.2% per year during next 5 years. If global economy GDP growth rate is sustaining and our external variables, it may be export, import, incoming foreign exchange in India, foreign exchange reserve position, current account deficit, all these fundamental factors are in our favor. That is why our growth rate is more sustainable. And in case of macroeconomy, because of internal and external factor, our fundamental macroeconomic variables are very stronger, which they are fiscal deficit, consumer price index, which you will code here, 5.4%, 4.6% respectively, current account deficit 1.2% of GDP during this financial year 2024-25 I am talking. And foreign exchange reserve position was quite well, capable to import 22 months. It means our all macroeconomic fundamental variables, so our internal economic policies, so despite trade disruption by global economy, geopolitics, uncertainty, our maximally growth rate determined by internal factor, it will be in coming days more sustainable or stable, and it is also steady. When you are writing on this one, you can say one point also include under your explanation, our unemployment rate in all our economy, urban, rural, as a whole, is decreasing consistently because government shift from government employment to self-employment generation policy. In this way, our growth rate is more steady in nature. This is the answer. Student, definitely you will get some kind of new. And if you have some kind of problem, you can write me on my YouTube channel, the Economica IAS, and you can ask any questions. I will proceed these kinds of process and further, so that you can get your maximum marks in third paper General Study 2025. Any query, you can contact me 9999237050. Thank you, student.